Hello and welcome to this lecture on representation, which is a lecture in the second module of our series of lectures in the course Cultural Studies, which is being recorded and recorded under the aegis of the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, which is a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We have already covered several lectures in module 1 and we have looked at a few key concepts in module 2, which is our current module. And we will recall that we discussed key concepts like subjectivity, identity. We devoted 2 lectures to what I said is a very important key concept in cultural studies, that of ideology. And today we are in another topic, which again is again a pivotal or seminal to studying cultural studies, and this is the topic called representation. Like the key concept ideology, representation is paramount, so to speak, in an understanding of cultural studies. So, I would be devoting 2 lectures to this topic. Now, as always, let us do a recap of what we learned in the last lecture. You will recall that we talked about ideology having several definitions, and we said that ideology may be seen as a set of ideas and ideals, as received consciousness, as a systematic body of concepts, and more importantly as maps of meaning or pointers to the creation of meaning. We also had occasion to look at a quotation from Chris Barker, which goes like this: "Today, the notion of ideology at best implies the binding and justifying ideas of all social groups." And you will recall that we focused on the 2 words binding and justifying, in that the notion of ideology binds people together, brings people together as a collective, and they are also ideas which are justifying, which justify in themselves why they should be valuable, and also binds people together as a community. Then we also looked at Douglas Kellner and Meenakshi Durham's words, wherein they say that the concept of ideology forces readers to perceive that all cultural texts have distinct biases, interests and embedded values. So, herein you recall that they do away with the notion of neutrality or the notion of some sort of a pristine innocence in the creation of meaning. Okay? And we are an understanding and analysis of the term, the key concept ideology, enables us to understand that all cultural texts, be they literary texts, be they other forms of cultural artifacts, inhere in themselves distinct biases and embedded values, and they reproduce the point of view of their producers and often the values of the dominant social group. This is an echo really of what Marx had said, if you remember, that the ruling ideas of any age are always the ideas of the ruling class. So, and when you look at ideology, we find that ideology is one such tool, okay, or the concept of ideology is is a tool that enables us to unearth, okay, so to speak, or to uncover the biases and the interests of ideas. What I will do is, in the last, because we are doing a recap here, in the last lecture there were a couple of slides because of the paucity of time. I had to leave them out of the last lecture. So, in this recap, I shall be quickly looking at those as well. Then we looked at Althusser and his structural Marxism, which talks about ideology as something that, within which we are, as he says, always already subjects. Okay? And where we practice, as he says, the rituals of ideological recognition. Our subjectivity within the Althusserian framework is something that is already present. Then we looked at an important word called interpolation in Althusser's theory, where he says that that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among individuals and transforms them. And then he says that there is a hailing, there is a calling out, which may be even something as commonplace as hey you there. So, cultural forms beckon to us, okay? They call us to come and fit ourselves, into the always, already that is available to us in culture. Then we also looked at Gramsci and and his important concept of hegemony, and where he talks about how consent to the prevailing ideology is manufactured by people, and it need not be always a coercive measure. Okay, we so to speak given to the ideology, and we are coerced in a non-violent sort of a way. Okay, so consent is manufactured. I left out this particular point, which is false consciousness, and by Marx, and I will come back to it by way of this recap. This is by Engels actually, and I am quickly reading it. Engels argued that ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker. Consciously, it is true, but with a false consciousness. The real motive forces impelling him remain unknown to him. Okay? Now, this is the connection between ideology as false consciousness. Okay? We are, of course, what he calls so-called thinkers, but we think in a false consciousness. Okay? The motives of the dominant class that create this create our thinking are not available to us, and hence we always live in a false consciousness. Otherwise, as he says here, otherwise it simply would not be an ideological process. If we are conscious about it, it cannot be ideology. Hence, he or we imagine false or apparent motives. What happens as a result is, it says here the realities of exploitation and subordination of the ruled are masked or concealed by the false consciousness of the ruled or the working class themselves. When there is an ideology that beckons to us, okay, in order that we are recruited, in Althusserian terms, we are recruited and we are transformed, then and when we give our consent to it in Gramscian terms, okay, what happens is we end up being in a false consciousness as long as we are unaware of the motives of the dominant class that creates the always already for us. Okay. So, I thought it fit to bring this point to your notice. Therefore, ideology is falsehood. Then I will end this recap with a quick reference to Rolla Barthes, whom you recall we had occasion to meet in our lecture on structuralism, and this is what he says about myths in Mythology, his book Mythologies. And he says here that bourgeois ideology is talking about bourgeois ideology continually transforming the products of history into essential types. This also is a part of the ideology. Okay? Now, bourgeois, come further down, bourgeois morality will essentially be a weighing operation. The essences will be placed in scales of which bourgeois man will remain the motionless beam. What Barthes is drawing attention to is the myths that sort of congeal, that coalesce after repetition, after several usage. These bourgeois myths are myths that transform us into types that become essential. Then he says, for the very end of myths is to immobilize the world. They must suggest and mimic a universal order which has fixated once and for all the hierarchy of possessions. And down in the last paragraph he says, myths are nothing but this ceaseless, untiring solicitation, this insidious and inflexible demand that all men recognize themselves in the image. In this sense, the myth or the image is also one of interpolation. The image calls out to us to conform ourselves to it. Okay? Yet eternal, yet bearing a date which was built of them one day as if for all time. And then finally, we come to, you are already acquainted with this person, Stuart Hall, on common sense, and he also brings in something that we rely on so much and something we feel is a given, that of common sense. And I am quoting from him, it is precisely its spontaneous quality, the spontaneous quality of common sense, its transparency, its naturalness, and its refusal to be made to examine the premises on which it is founded, its resistance to change or correction, its effect of instant recognition, and the closed circle in which it moves, which makes common sense and at the same time spontaneous, ideological and unconscious. The important thing to be noticed here is that the very spontaneity of common sense hides from us the fact that it is ideological. Okay? So, many commonsensical things, as many critics say, are really not sensible. Okay? Then further, you cannot learn through common sense how things are, you can only discover where they fit into the existing scheme of things. In this way, it is very, what he says, the taken for grantedness. Taken for grantedness is which establishes it as a medium in which its own premises and presuppositions are being rendered invisible by its apparent transparency. So, the spontaneity of common sense, the very taken for grantedness of common sense, the apparent transparency of common sense as knowledge is something that hides the ideology behind it. So, the point made by Stuart Hall here is that common sense itself is saturated, okay, and itself is filled with ideology. Well, after the recap, we now come to the topic the topic of discussion in the current lecture, which is representation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I shall be devoting 2 lectures to this topic. First, let us look at the dictionary meaning of representation as given to us by the Chambers 20th Century Dictionary. Representation is an act or a state or a fact of representing or being represented. Okay? Representation stands for that which represents something, maybe all images, pictures, dramatic performances, mental images, a presentation of a view of facts or arguments. A representation may also be in legal terms a petition, or in political terms a petition. It can be a remonstrance, an expostulation, an assumption of succession by an heir. It can also refer to a body of representatives. So, the dictionary meaning of representation is not really what we discuss or what we take for an understanding of the term representation in cultural studies. Okay? Of course, all these are a part of that, but there is a definite political shade to the term representation as we employ it in cultural studies. Now, we shall look at one such way, and as said in several times, Chris Barker's definition in the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies comes in handy. So, I am going to in this lecture I am going to really focus on 2 persons, 2 critics. One is Chris Barker and the other is Danny Cavallaro. And in the lecture after this, in the second part of representation, I shall be looking at work done by Stuart Hall and a few other critics. For a beginning where we unpack the term representation, it suffices for us to take up Chris Barker and Danny Cavallaro's work. Now, let us read. A set of processes by which signifying practices appear to stand for or depict another object or practice in the real world. Now, look at the kind of words that are being used here by Chris Barker. Okay? Representation, he takes from the dictionary meaning, he takes it to mean that representation is a representation, okay, or a standing in for something else, or a standing for something else. We will read this again. Representation refers to a set of processes by which signifying practices appear to stand for, okay, or depict another object or practice in the real world. So, there is therefore there is a difference between an object as it stands or as it is in the real world, and the way or the object or the artifact or the image that, as you have seen in the last slide, the image or the picture, okay, or the mental image that we employ to stand for that real object. So, in this itself, there the disconnect is already available to us here, is already apparent to us here, as pointed out by Chris Barker. Now, let us see what he says further. Representation is thus an act of symbolism. Okay, we all have an idea of what symbolism is. Okay, the use of symbols to stand for something else. Representation is thus an act of symbolism that mirrors an independent object world. However, now he is moving away from the dictionary definition. He says, however, for cultural studies, representation does not simply reflect in symbolic forms things that exist in an independent object world. There is a problematic here, okay, as is indicated by Chris Barker's words. He says that within the domain of cultural studies, there is no pure reflectionism here. Okay? Representation is not a direct reflection in symbolic forms of things that exist in independently in and sort of outside world. Okay? Rather, he says, and this is extremely important for our understanding of the way representation is a tool or a key concept in cultural studies. Rather, representations are constitutive of the meaning of which they purport to stand in for. The sense, now you will realize that the represented, more than the represented object, the representation, okay, the object that represents is given more importance. Look at this again. Representations are constitutive, they are not reflective of the meaning. They are constitutive of the meaning of that which they purport to stand in for. That is why we need to look, it is important when the represented object is not important, the representation is important, then we need to look at what that representation is doing, what ideology is behind that particular representation, which is constitutive of the meaning. It is not simply reflective. Then he says in the last paragraph, that is, representation does not involve correspondence between signs and objects. There is no direct correspondence, there is no unmediated correspondence, there is no, so to speak, an innocent correspondence, okay, between the object that is represented and the representation that stands in, so to speak, for that object. So, Barker says that is, representation does not involve correspondence between signs and objects, but creates the representational effect of realism. So, representation here is understood, or it is evaluated more in terms of the effect that is created by such symbolism, the effect that is created by such standing in for. Okay? So, we realize by now that we have already moved in with the help of Chris Barker from the dictionary meaning of representation as something that stands in for something and is reflective of something. Okay? What are the important words here? The important words here are that they are constitutive of the meaning of which they purport to stand for, representational effect, that it is the effect of the representation that is more important than the object. Okay? Now, if you look at it in a schematic way in this slide, signifying practices okay, are acts of symbolism, are acts of representation, okay, which are supposed to mirror, they are supposed to mirror reality. Okay. The problem here is this, in the very act of mirroring or in this very so-called mimetic act, there are several factors that come in which have to do with ideology, which have to do with power, which have to do with politics, as long as we are studying this under the domain of cultural studies. Okay. And importantly, as is shown here in this slide, okay, there is a non-correspondence. Okay. We have already sort of delinked it from the object being represented, and then we are going to study the representational effect. Therefore, representation, we see in this slide, representation have to do with not just material objects. Okay. Representation is not simply a matter of representing material objects. It is important that representation is also a social practice. Okay. Representation is a social practice, and meaning and intelligibility, okay, of whether material objects or mental objects, okay, meaning and intelligibility are tied down to social practices. Now, for the purposes of this slide, what can you name the term that we can use for social practices? The term that we can use for social practices in this case is therefore ideology. Okay. Now, if you look at this slide here, it is ideology that is behind representation, which ultimately gives us the meaning and intelligibility of any phenomenon. Okay. Now, again, as Barker had said, the meaning and intelligibility are not separate, from what they purport to tell us or to represent to us. At the same time, they are constitutive of them. Therefore, representation, like ideology, is a map of meaning. Okay. Now, the important thing to understand here is that representation is not only a map of meaning. In this, we understood maps of meaning, what these mean in our lecture on ideology. They are like ideology, maps of meaning, but importantly, they also, the representations also constitute that map. Okay. There is a subtle difference between ideology as maps of meaning and representation as maps of meaning, in the sense that there is a second element here. Okay. Like ideology, representations are maps of meaning, and secondly, representation also constitutes that map. Why? Because in this case, we are interested not in the object that is represented. We are interested in in the fact that the representation itself is constitutive of or constitutes that map. So much so that we can even say, even in cultural studies, representation is all. Okay? The real object, so to speak, remains sort of left behind. Okay? And it is that is why representation is so loaded with ideology. Okay? That it is important for us to unravel or uncover all that goes into the building of the representation itself, that all that inheres in creating a representation effect. Why? Because after all, we deal with representations. Okay? After all, we do not deal with objects in a direct reference all the time, right? For instance, when we speak about something, we are already undertaking the process of representing something. You speak about anything, you speak about any person, any critic, any scientist and his works. The moment we use language, we are already creating it, recreating it, representing it for our purposes and for the purposes of our audience. And that is why to study representation is immensely important. Then again, let us look at what Barker says here. Thus, the investigation of culture has often been regarded as virtually interchangeable with the exploration of what he calls here the processes of representation. Look at this sentence again. the investigation of culture ultimately means the investigation of the processes of representation. Such is the importance of representation in cultural studies. Further, while culture is not just a matter of representations, but also of practices and spatial arrangements. Now, this word spatial, you know, is to do with space. We distinguish it from the word special, SPE. Okay? The word also of practices and spatial arrangements. It can nevertheless be argued that it is the process of representation that makes practices meaningful and significant to us. Now, what Barker is saying here is that, well, I agree. We agree that culture is not just, it is not just representations or representation effects. We agree that culture is also a matter of different cultural practices and different arrangements in both in space, actually, both in space and time. But he says that we can very well argue that the process of representation, the process of symbolization, okay, is that which makes practices meaningful and significant to us. These last two words I think are very important, okay, meaningful and significant. How do we acquire, how do we take out meaning from those very practices and spatial arrangements that he is talking about here? It is only through the process of representation. The significance of things, the meaning of things, the value of things is available to us not by the object per se, but as it is mediated through a process of representation. So, representation is intrinsically bound up with questions of power through the process of selection and organization. So, obviously, if you have to represent something, you cannot talk about everything about that object or that cultural event or that even be it a scientific phenomenon. Okay? You would have to be selective and you would have to organize it in a certain way. Now, the whole process of selection and organization is seminal to the representation process. Okay? Since, as we have already said, we cannot talk about everything regarding a certain object or phenomenon. And secondly, we have to organize it in such a way that it seems intelligible to people. This is what we talked about just a while ago, okay? Making things intelligible, making things significant, making things meaningful, and even making things have value for us. Okay? So, representation is therefore bound up with questions of power. Now, power is related to the way we select and organize things. Now, here it does not mean that you every time you select and organize phenomena that you are always thinking that it is giving me power and it is an act of power on my part. The word power here is used more in the Foucauldian sense of power, the ever presence of power in society. Okay? So, when we select and organize, we already have an ideology, okay, that propels us to select, most of the time, propels us to select and organize things in a bid to represent those things. So, the power of representation lies in its enabling some kinds of knowing or some kinds of knowledge to exist while excluding other ways of seeing. This is most important. Okay? The moment, it is quite obvious really, the moment you select something and the moment you leave out other aspects of it, the moment you organize things in a certain way, you are already engaging in a process of inclusion and exclusion. Therefore, representation as power is both inclusive and exclusive. This is important to keep for us to keep in mind. Why? Because it is power that or ideology that is going to sort of determine what is included and what is excluded. So, representation is also synonymous in this sense with power and ideology. So, as I said, the next critic that I am going to whose words I am going to use and then I am going to explain them, okay, text I am using is from his book entitled Critical and Cultural Theory. It's a very useful book because it talks about all the chapters are devoted to different concepts, okay, and I am basing my lecture of this part of this lecture on Danny Cavallero's words. Now, this is what Cavallaro says. Today, many important developments in critical and cultural theory are associated with what he calls a crisis in representation. He says that it is not only representation, analyzing representation, looking at the various aspects of representation that are important in cultural studies. Today, currently, he says there is a crisis in representation, there is a crisis in our understanding, in the sense that there are ways in which, as we can use this word, representation has been problematized further. Okay. Now, the moment we come away from from the dictionary definition of representation, what we have done is we have already problematized it, but Cavallaro seems to think here that there is a further problematization and he calls this a crisis in the humanities as far as representation goes. Now, how does it happen? Now, let us read from Cavallaro's text. That the study of representation must take into account a wide variety of cultural phenomena. We need to understand in the first place that the study of representation should take into account the variety of cultural phenomena, philosophical perspectives and ideological programs. We have human beings operating in disparate cultural and historical contexts, and we have felt the need to represent themselves and their environments. Why do certain cultures openly admit to the constructed and fictional status of their representation, and others seek to pass them off as natural and real? He says that there are cultures which readily admit the fact that their representations are fictions, their representations are constructed, and they even celebrate the fact, okay, that these are constructions. But he asks this question, why in other cases, why are why are there also cultures which seek to pass their representations off as what we call natural and real, being as close to reality or the real object, so to speak, to use the word faithful to the original. Okay. So, we need to also investigate why some cultures celebrate the fictionality of the representations and why other cultures hang on to them, okay, as if they were the faithful copies of the original. Second question he asks here, what do different forms of representation tell us about the societies, communities and individuals that produce them? Okay. So, representations have different forms. Okay. The way I represent something and the way you represent something, for instance, the way simply put, the way man is represented in in cultural studies, in sociology, in anthropology, in literature, okay, it is different from the way man is represented in biology. Okay. Biology would refer to man as Homo sapiens, but in literature, for instance, we would look at in most cases the inner life of man, his passions, his feelings, his moral dilemmas, etc. Okay. So, he asks, what do different forms of representation tell us about the societies and the communities that produce them? This is something that is needed to be investigated. Okay. Who are representations addressed to or aimed at? This is the third important question. Okay. What was the first question? Why is there, why is it a fact that some cultures openly celebrate the fictionality on the constructedness of the representations, where others take great pains or go to great lengths to assert that their representations are closest to the original. Second question was these different forms of representation belonging to different societies, communities, or even knowledge domains, like I said, the literature on the one hand, and on the other hand, as I said, biology in representing what man is. Okay. So, why do these different domains, different cultures have different forms of representation? Point number 3, the question he asks is, who are representations addressed to and aimed at? We need to look at these very carefully. This is what he calls there is a crisis in representation, in the sense that we need to further the problematization of the word representation. Then look at, this is what he says, and I am quoting from Danny Cavallaro: "A representation only represents by virtue of being interpreted, and ultimately represents anything it is capable of representing. That is, it has an indefinite number of potential, as it says, potential representational contexts." Okay. Here representation is tied to this word interpretation. A representation only represents by virtue of being interpreted, and we have to keep in mind that there are myriad ways of interpretations, okay? And the way things are interpreted is tied to the way a thing is represented. And then he says we have to admit the fact that there is there is an indefinite number of potential representational contents. Even as we look, study, analyze and eventually accept or consume one representation, it is important to keep in mind that there is an immense number of, or as it says, an indefinite number of potential representational contents. For every, so to speak, official representation of something, there are other potential representational contents that in terms of cultural studies, because of ideology, because of power, do not see the light of day. Second, he says the concept of representation is also intimately connected to that of repetition. On the first case we had interpretation, and the second case we have repetition. Okay. How is repetition important for representation? When a representation is repeated over and over in a cultural setup, okay, it sort of instantiates itself as the dominant representation. Just a while ago we spoke of several potential, okay, there are potential representational contents, of which only one or two make it as a dominant representation or representation effect, and these dominant representations or representational effects, they establish themselves in the cultural order through a process of repetition, because if it is not repeated, then it does not enter the cultural realm in an established sort of way. Then he says it could be argued that words, for example, are representations which only acquire meaning to the extent that they may be repeated, namely used again in different contexts. Now, we had if you remember, we had this lecture, we had a discussion on structuralism, okay, and wherein we said the language or words are a matter of convention, right? Words have to be used, we have to submit to the convention called the language system, and that is how words which are essentially arbitrary in nature, okay, begin to have what we call social currency or communication currency. Okay, we will look at this again. It could be argued that words, for example, are representations which only acquire meaning to the extent that they may be repeated, namely used again in different contexts. Imagine if you coined a word today, okay, which is very possible. We have neologisms or new words being added to the dictionaries all the time. Now, if such a word was coined by you and it was used only once or only twice maybe by you, okay, and not by anyone else, what happens is the word, this neologism or this new word dies down, okay, it dies away because it has not gone through or not been through this important process called repetition, and particularly where different people use it in different contexts. Okay. So, like words, words which are ultimately representations are ultimately symbol. What is the word tree, for instance? The word tree is a representation or a symbol for the for the object tree. Now, there is nothing tree-ish, as you will recall we had discussed in our lecture on structuralism. There is nothing tree-ish in a tree. Okay? There is nothing tree in the tree, so that it calls out to say that look, I am ontologically or essentially a tree. How is this proven? This is proven by the fact that there are different words in different linguistic systems, different cultures, to represent the object tree. Okay? So, the point Cavalier is making here, I feel, is that words are also representations. Okay? And you can also say, or the reverse or the inverse, that cultural representations may also be seen as words and languages. Then we come to the philosophical aspect of what Cavalier is saying, and I am quoting again from his text. The world cannot be represented accurately and objectively for the reason that it is not a given, but rather an effect of how it is perceived from various viewpoints. Now, you will recall in one of my lectures I discussed, talked about epistemology. Okay, or the theory of knowledge, and also the suggestion given by several philosophers that there is a reality and we represent the reality to us, to ourselves, to our fellow men, using the cognitive structures, using the the hardware, so to speak, and software of our brains, the brain and the mind, and we represent them according to the way we are sort of allowed to see reality through our cognitive apparatuses. So, this sentence by Cavalier takes on a philosophical dimension, as I have said. The world cannot be represented accurately and objectively. There is nothing called objectivity. The world, even if it is represented through science, has a certain amount of subjectivity in it. For the reason that it is not a given, the world for us is never a given, but the world is a representational effect. Okay? Reality is a representational effect. Look at the profundity of what is being suggested here, that we cannot have access to reality as it is, at least not wholly. Yes, science does give us a picture, sort of a true picture, in the sense that science works and you can replicate experiments, you can re-establish the veracity of certain scientific facts. But in a philosophical sense, then reality is an effect, okay, of how it is perceived from various viewpoints. Secondly, as he says, much recent criticism has claimed that the real as such is unattainable. We only experience it through the mediation of text, images and stories. Now, look at this very important point. Okay, the real is unattainable. Okay, and this is an acceptance of the fact that we cannot attain a whole, a holistic, so to speak, a knowledge about reality, and that the mediation here is done through things like text, images and stories. And after all, what is a text? What is an image? And what is a story? You are right, the answer is representation. Okay? Even a scientific text may be called, from a humanities or perspective, from a philosophical perspective, a representational text. So, reality comes through us. Again, we find the importance of the term representation, mediated. Okay? Reality is available to us through a mediation of certain representational effects, which come to us in representational forms. What are these representational forms? These representational forms are what we find here in Cavalier's words. These are the texts, the images and stories that we construct. Remember, text, images and stories are maps of meaning, okay? And according to Stuart Hall, they are not just maps of meaning, they are constitutive of that meaning. Okay? So, it seems that text, images and stories are all that we can ever have, okay? In the sense, mediated reality through representation is all that we can have. The picture is not so pessimistic as it may seem. Okay? The point is, to a large extent, these representations work, particularly in science. Where we have to be very careful is in terms of the social and political and cultural realm, okay, where text, images and stories, and remember Rolla Barthes talking about ideology, okay, myths, these sometimes are circulated in such a way that they seem to be quote unquote natural for us, they seem to be givens for us. This is where we have to be very, very careful. And I think Cavallaro rightly terms this as a crisis in representation. The crisis particularly is a philosophical one when we realize that we cannot have an unmediated access to reality, and that reality is available to us only as representational effects. Then he says, what about these stories, these texts that we have been talking about? Now, I am quoting him again, these stories and texts, these never mirror reality. We have long left behind that mimetic school of thought. These never mirror reality transparently and neutrally, but actually represented according to the codes and are accordingly naturalized, that is, their status as constructs is effaced. The important thing to note here is that you may think that these mirror reality, but actually it is according to certain codes. Codes of what? Codes of both, remember the two words, selecting and organizing, the two words that we had occasion to talk about a couple of slides ago. Okay. There are codes, there are norms, there are rules as to how you may select and how you may organize things. Okay. So, reality is represented according to those codes, okay, that through which things are naturalized. So, when we accept a thing as real, we are accepting the representation. It is very important to note, we are in a philosophical sense accepting the representation, we are learning the codes by which the selection has been done, the organizing has been done, we are learning the codes through which we can unpack and understand such selection and organization. Okay. And what happens as a result of these, the process of repetition, or as the result of submitting to this encoding and decoding, what happens is, look at this word here, the status of these representational forms as constructs is effaced or erased or removed. Okay. We forget, right, we forget that these things are simply, here is the word, that these things are simply constructs, right. Through repetition there is naturalization, and the representation therefore literally stands for or is the object itself. Okay. Then representations are a vital means of supporting a culture's ideology. Now, again we come full circle here, okay, back to ideology, right. So, these representations, these texts, these stories, these images, as I have just said, begin to stand for the real thing and are real to us, and are these things that are circulated in a community, in a culture, in a society, okay, they support a culture's ideology. The world view, remember we talked about ideology as a world view, and I am reading this again. Representations are a vital means of supporting a culture's ideology, the worldview invented by that culture to legitimate itself and to discipline its subjects. I think these last two words are immensely important. Okay. We know by now that representation is deeply tied down to ideology. In fact, it is a vehicle of ideology. Okay. Through circulation and constant repetition, it becomes a carrier or a vehicle of ideology. And as we learnt in the last two lectures, every ideology, okay, is a world view. It is a way of looking at the world. These are lenses through which you view the world, and the world view invented by that culture, right, it is also a vehicle. Representations are a vehicle of a particular culture's dominant ideology. Let us not use the word ideology just as it is, because they are ideologies. We are talking about a culture's dominant ideology. Now, what happens is when representation becomes a vehicle of ideology, okay, it ends up legitimizing that very dominant ideology. It ends up legitimizing that very culture to sometimes even show that this is the best way things can be selected and organized, okay, to legitimate itself and importantly to discipline its subjects, okay, because if you have to learn the codes of both encoding and decoding culture, of encoding and decoding culture through representations and representational effects, okay, you are already disciplined into it. Now, the word disciplining has, in this sense several nuances. Is you enter a discipline, so for instance, when you do the sciences, you have to talk in a certain way, okay, you have to use a certain discourse. When you are in another setup, in a religious setup for instance, you are not talking about man as a biological being all the while, you are talking of man in a different way. So, different representations kind of again let us use Althusser's term, okay, interpolate or hail or beckon, call out to you to discipline yourselves. Okay. So, in the sense discipline here also means as in giving into, being sort of a good cultural person, okay, in adhering to the representations of the dominant culture. Okay. I think here Cavallero has several very important things to say, both in terms of a philosophical understanding of representation and in terms of a cultural political way of looking at representation effects that legitimize a culture's dominant ideology and also discipline its subjects into accepting that ideology. Further, he says, thus the central concern of any critical assessment of representations should consist of now what is our job therefore is not just to submit ourselves, to discipline ourselves and to add to the legitimization of culture. He says the central concern, we have to critically assess these representations and representational effects. The central concern of any critical assessment of representation therefore should consist of denaturalizing. Okay. These have been naturalized through what? If you recall, these have been naturalized through constant repetition and circulation in the culture, and we should denaturalize these. Denaturalizing what? As I said, look at the slide here please. Both the cultural images and the institutionalized responses to such images that surround us at all times. Okay. We have to sort of lay bare, right. We have to decode the codes themselves. Okay. We have to decode the process that goes into the making of the naturalization of such representations, and we should denaturalize what? Both the image that has that represents the phenomenon, and secondly also the institutionalized responses, our responses to the images, to the pictures, to the stories that circulate as the dominant representations are also institutionalized, in the sense that we are even indoctrinated into decoding them. Why? Because we have learned the codes as cultural people. Okay. So, these surround us at all time, and it is cultural studies as a discipline, okay, which or as a domain of study which trains us to be careful about representations, which trains us not to consume the images and stories which stand as the dominant representations, and which also teach us to be wary of the fact that our responses are learned responses, our responses are learned through a process of institutionalization, even indoctrination into the way we should respond. That is the way we respond, the way we look at, the way we study, and finally the way we accept and imbibe any representational effect has to be critically analyzed and critically assessed. Next, this entails questioning many of the concepts and symbols which we are generally invited to take for granted as timeless, objective, and a matter of common sense. Okay. There should be a process of questioning these symbols, questioning the concepts, and we are invited. Look at the word invited, it is like again Althusser's term interpolation, and we think that, or rather ideology tells us that these representations are for all time to come. They are timeless, they are objective, and they are a matter of common sense. So, all these three words, timelessness, objectivity and common sense, are things that are not accepted as they are in cultural studies. Nothing is timeless, okay? Nothing has a pure absolute objectivity, and common sense is not sensible or does not make sense all the time, particularly across cultures. Okay? It is only ideology that calls out to us to accept these as timeless and objective. Therefore, any cultural product can be approached as a form of representation, offering, look at this, vital clues to a culture's belief system. Therefore, if you have to study any culture, if you have to critically assess a culture including your own, you need to you need to look at any of its cultural products. Why? Because any cultural product is after all a representation, okay? Be it any sort of a text is really a representation of what exists. Now, if you keep in mind that any cultural product is really a representation, it will tell you a lot about the culture where it comes from, particularly the beliefs, the axioms, the postulates that the cultures take for granted as timeless, take for granted as an objective account of reality, or even as common sense. Okay? It gives us an idea of its interpretations of reality and its the way in which it translates both factual and fictional situations into images. There is a lot that remains to be discussed, and as I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, we will take these up in the next lecture on part 2 of representation. Let us now quickly look at what we have discussed so far in the form of questions that may be put to you in the exams. For instance, if you are given a question like this, delineate the scope of the term representation. From a dictionary point of view, we would say that representation may mean an act, a state or fact of representing, of being represented. It may be a mental image, it is maybe a presentation of of a view of facts or arguments. It could mean a petition, and it could also mean a body of representatives. Now, the scope, if you are asked the scope of representation in cultural studies, you need to also bring in the rest of what we have discussed. For instance, you would say that representation obviously means all these things that I have talked about, but in cultural studies the scope of representation is enlarged to bring in the political, to bring in the term representational effect, to tie it to terms like ideology, okay, and power. Now, the next question, describe the concept of representation as articulated by Chris Barker, and then you would say, you would put emphasis on certain words in Barker. For instance, Barker says that representations are sets of processes by which signifying practices stand for. Okay? There is an act of symbolism, there is an act of symbolism here, things stand for things. Okay? And then secondly, when he says for cultural studies, representation is not simply reflectionism, okay, that they are constitutive of the very meanings that they stand in for. The two words, they are maps of meanings and they are also constitutive of meanings. Then representation does not involve a clear correspondence between signs and objects, but this is the term representational. This is what you have to bring to the notice of the examiner, that there is a representational effect which stands for and becomes more sort of real than the real object. Thirdly, where does the power of representation lie? We would say that the power of representation lies in the fact that we select and organize things according to the ideology of the culture in which we live. So, the power of representation enables, in a Foucauldian sort of way, some kinds of knowledge to exist while excluding. Okay? So, inclusion and exclusion are part of it, and selection and organization is what gives power to the representation. Then why do we say after Danny Cavallaro that there has been a crisis in representation studies? Okay? We will say this, that according to Danny Cavallaro, we realize that as a recent criticism has shown us, that reality as such is unattainable, and this is what brings in, from a philosophical point of view, the crisis in representation, that we experience representation only through mediation of representation, that is mediation, or we understand reality only through the mediation of texts, images and stories, and that texts, images and stories in themselves are representations, and they seem to be more real, at least. And you can add this point, that it is culture and the ideology of a particular culture that naturalizes, seeks to naturalize these things and make us learn the codes, okay, through which we are our responses are institutionalized, and we are disciplined, so to speak, as subjects into being a part of such representational effects. Okay. So, we stop here now, and there is of course a lot more to be said about representation, and some of those things which we would be then covering in the next lecture, which would be part 2 of representation. Thank you.